excellent. So the purpose of the recording, I'll read out the info slide as well as the motion. The info slide, aspiring K-pop artists known as trainees sign a contract with management agencies when the trainee is sometimes as young as it can take up to 10 years of training before a trainee makes a mistake. The motion reads that we should ban under 18 to engage in K-pop idol training contracts. The call from the first speaker of this earlier to open debate. Sorry. I am a fundamentally different person today than I was at age 12. If you told me now that I had to follow the career path that I thought was super cool at age 12, I would be like trying and failing to be an Olympic swimmer at this point. That would be incredibly bad for me. It was something that I was never going to succeed at. And it was something that locked me really unhappy and live an incredibly unfulfilled life. So what then in this speech? Firstly, setup. Secondly, in terms of like why on principle these contracts are bad and why they're necessarily coercive. Like can't consent. And then thirdly, in terms of the practical outcomes, whether you make it in the industry or whether you don't, why this is going to be like incredibly damaging for you as a person and why we would far prefer what we think the actual counterfactual is here. So in terms of setup, I think like they tell us in the info slide, you sign your contract, you're locked in for a certain amount of training, and then probably what's going to happen in terms of what the contract looks like is that they're going to be relatively long-term, right? Why? Because the company is investing in you and they want return on their investment. They're not just going to be like, 10 years of training down the drain, whatever, I guess. They're probably going to be relatively tight and it's going to be pretty difficult to opt out of them because of like the analysis on why companies want return on their investment. The second thing to say is that given the popularity of like the rags to riches story in Korea, this is probably going to like target low SES people because they can't afford to like get into the industry just through like taking a bunch of lessons. And getting in that way, it's probably going to be a situation where they like have to trade off getting into this long-term, very like difficult to get out of contract in exchange for potentially a surer path or even like an entry into the industry. In terms of what we far would prefer is just like no contracts, no lock-in contracts for children. We would prefer that like people take lessons to the extent that they can and the extent that they want. The two things to say here is that it means that they can opt out pretty much whenever they want. Maybe you like finish your term of dance lessons, but you're not locked in for like the better part of a decade. And you're also like not locked in to pay back a company a bunch of money if you do make it in the industry, which means that like you keep more of your own money if you ever do make it once you turn 18. And it's also much less risk for a label to sign you once you turn 18 because you're like already probably pretty good at doing K-pop things because you've been training for it. So like it's less risky investment for them, which means they don't need to like hold you to as strict a contract. Okay. So then, in terms of argumentation, why do we think these contracts are going to be pretty bad and why is this principle bad? It's just that like kids absolutely can't consent. 4 things to say under this. 1, they tell us in the info slide they can be as young as 12. I don't know if anyone here has recently spoken to a 12-year-old. They're pretty fucking stupid, right? There's a reason we don't let them make most of their own decisions. Even if this were a case where like parents were consenting for them, I think it's like obviously something the kid wants to do. There's a reason we don't let them make their own decisions. But the second thing to say here is that parents probably have a financial incentive to like push their kids into doing these things. Noting what we told you in setup about how probably these are people coming from low SES backgrounds, parents probably have a financial incentive because it would be really sick if your kid became a massive K-pop star and like solved all of your financial issues, right? The third thing to say is that parents also have an emotional incentive for 2 reasons. 1, because K-pop is a pretty prestigious industry, but 2, because if your kid says, hey, I really want to be a pop star, and you see an opportunity for them to be a pop star, you're probably going to be like, yeah, okay, cool. I kind of want to make their dream come true, right? That's like something you want to do as a parent. The 4th thing to say here is there's just like absolutely no informed consent for anyone in this debate, right? Because kids just absolutely can't conceptualize like what life is going to be like as a K-pop star. Firstly, because the media pushes a certain narrative in that it's all like very glamorous and very cool. Also because your parents are probably pushing you into this industry, given what we told you in points 2 and 3. But also because like being a pop star sounds pretty sick, right? Like if you had the opportunity to do it as a kid, if I was 12 and I was there, someone was like, hey, I'm going to train you for a few years and they're going to like be a pop star, I'd be like, wow, that is really cool. I want to do that. I'd have no idea like the demands of being a pop star. You just like can't conceptualize it. This is all to say, the kids, even kids alone and also kids with the support of their parents, probably just like can't consent to this. We would far prefer that they received training to the extent that they could, and like didn't enter into this contract. I think to say on the counter, like probably coercion still exists to an extent, in that like parents can be like, oh, wouldn't you like to do some dance lessons so you can be a pop star? But we think that like the comparative principal harm is way less, for 2 reasons. Firstly, long term, like you can't opt out of a massive like K-pop contract the same way you can a term's worth of singing lessons. The second thing to say is that like if you do make it in the industry, you have to repay the investment that they have put into you, which is just like not symmetric if you're like taking normal K-pop lessons. So, and even later, if you decide to like stay in the industry because you really love it and it's like really cool for you, this is still coercive. It is still something that we don't support on our side of the house. All of this is to say that like these contracts are very, very bad, regardless of what the outcomes are. But even if you don't buy that, let's whether you make it or not, the outcomes are just going to be in training for such a long time. So, what do the contracts actually look like in terms of the demands on the child themselves? I think 3 things. First, they're going to look like a heavy like exercise regime and very specific exercise requirements, as well as very specific food monitoring. Because there is a very like specific beauty standard in Korea, especially so on like public figures and pop stars, which they're going to want these kids to fit into because it increases their chance of success and marketability. Secondly, it's going to be incredibly heavy time commitments. They're going to be doing a ton of training, singing, dancing, working out, etc. And the third thing to say is that like K-pop stars are like, it's very important to their labels like what their reputation is. So they're going to be probably like mandating to an extent like the way that they're going to like, try and prohibit them from falling into bad crowds or like non-palatable groups of people. The impact of this is firstly that you just have like a shit childhood, right? You like without a contract, you just have like way more freedom. You have a life. You can leave if you want. You can like stop doing singing things. Like with a contract, it just means that like you're locked in to a very specific lifestyle that like maybe you don't like 3 years later. You know, like when you're a teenager, your goals and aspirations and personality like changes dramatically. It is highly likely that between the ages of like 14 and 19, you like decide that you don't want to do this, or at least your priorities change. The thing to say is that you probably end up with like significant and lasting health issues. Firstly, in terms of physical health, like overworking a developing body is like very, very bad for it. Over the course of your life, your muscles are far more likely to deteriorate. Your joints are far more likely to cause you a lot of pain. We see this in like young female athletes all the time. They lose their periods, their reproductive systems like suffer long-term damage. But the second thing to say is that like your mental health is probably going to like take a pretty big hit. For 2 reasons. For 2 reasons. Firstly, because the K-pop industry is like pretty toxic. As I told you, the beauty standards are incredibly strict. You're probably going to be like bullied or like mocked to an extent. It's also like quite bad for a child who has like probably developing self-esteem, and also probably like you end up with some form of eating disorder because your eating habits and exercise regime have been like mandated and restricted since you were 12. The second thing to say is that there are incredible pressures on you to succeed if your parents and a company have like invested in you long term, and they put a bunch of money into trying to like help you and make sure that you make it in this world. But I think the important thing to note here is that like most trainees are not going to make it. Why is this true? A few reasons. First, it's just like empirically true. Most trainee K-pop idols just don't do it. The second thing is that even if you do realize that it's very the turnover of idols. The third thing to say is that there are some factors that are just like very hard to predict when you're a young trainee. Very hard to predict how your voice will develop. Maybe you're a great singer at 12, maybe you're a shit singer at 20. And also like the market is incredibly saturated. Okay, this is like, obviously bad because like you lose your life and everything. But I think the thing to say is that you like create a relationship with your family, you have to pay back a lot of money, all these reasons you don't support these contracts.
I think the first one is fantastic.
The reason K-pop has become so popular and the reason it has been so amazing both for Korea culturally and economically is because there are huge swaths of Korean students and huge swaths of Asian diaspora living in Western states who currently have no representation of themselves, no representation of like how they act in the media at a young age. And they get this from K-pop, and it is an incredible benefit that you need to win way highly in this debate. Firstly, some setup. Secondly, why do we think entering into these contracts is actually really good for you? Secondly, why do you get massive benefits for K-pop enjoyers? Thirdly, why do we think this is great for South Korean? Firstly, setup. A few things to say. The first is just that, like, obviously you can still go to school. Secondly, you can opt out. They spend a lot of time talking about how, like, you probably can't opt out, and they give a few mechanisms, some of which I'll deal with later in my point. The thing to say is that, like, yes, if you do invest in these contracts, presumably you can also break the contract if there is some financial penalty for this. Like the state of these contracts currently is just that, like, if you succeed and you debut, you do have to, like, fulfill your contract. You do have to pay that back to the company. If you don't, most of the time they waive the fees that they've paid for you and the fees that they've invested in your training. That is legally what happens. If the opposition, like, really pushes back on this, says that it's not true, we're happy to kind of fiat that in. I think at the point at which you're banning everyone from participating in these contracts, we can probably write in that maybe you don't have any financial penalty if you exit the contracts. The third thing is to say is that, like, when people are older, they get protected less. And there's a few mechanisms for this, but, like, obviously the industry will still need people. I think they agree with this in their counterfactual, which is just like, you probably go into it, you debut at a later point in your time. A few things for this. Firstly, the fan base, which is, let's be real, a majority very young fan base, relates to you less. You get a lot less support from them, and I'll talk about why that's particularly important in a second. Secondly, you have a much higher opportunity cost against getting a job. Like, you now have to hedge your bets against going to university. That is a harm that you don't have to take into account when you were younger. The third thing to say is just like, oh, maybe you don't have contracts, you just have lessons. Firstly, you debut way later then because you don't have the time to actually form a group that you have to get into. Like, those are the kind of things that you're doing at the same time when you're in contracts. You're, like, contracted to a company, they form a group for you, they get you all together. You also just do less well if you haven't been with your group for the same amount of time. The last thing is to say that, like, the government probably has pretty good incentives to, like, care about the welfare of these children because they, like, are children, and, like, for that, I think that is pretty intuitive to governments. If, for example, these contracts are, like, super pernicious and you can't, like, we're happy to, like, also fiat in, maybe you have some information there about, like, what are the potential harms to your body with, like, routine exercise, what are the potential benefits, etc., etc. Moving on to the most important point, I think, in this debate, because it's the one that they spend the most time on. Why do we think entering into these contracts is actually really good for you? Four kind of main reasons. Firstly, why do these companies actually likely to treat you pretty well? The first is that companies have pretty solid incentives to, like, treat you really nicely, and that is for a few reasons. Firstly, because PR is really important. Like, at the point at which you are a trainee and you are still on a contract, you haven't debuted yet, but what they fail to realize is that a lot of K-pop companies invest very heavily in the PR and invest very heavily in, like, the advertising of their groups before they have even debuted, because it guarantees more success once they have debuted. That is really important because you are trying to garner a fan base, like, as early as possible. That is really important because, like, first of all, like, you're more incentivized to treat them well because they need to be able to be smiling in their PR appearances. They need to be able to have fun. So, like, do well when they interact with fans. But secondly, they also need to, like, they also build a fan base at this point, and the fan base is, like, very likely to hold these companies to account, if anything, if they feel that their idols are being mistreated. That is because people really latch on in the same way that, like, you latch on to any celebrity. You latch on to the kind of people that you become in a fan base of. That is really important because they are likely to hold companies to account where they feel that they are doing things wrong, and companies who rely on the fans for money have very strong incentive to listen to that. The next thing is just to say that, like, they give you lots of reasons why, like, oh, you probably have to exercise a lot, you probably have certain food requirements. Like, yeah, and who would be a better place to know these than a company that specializes in the, like, dancing and singing and, like, everything training of these idols, like presumably they know that they have to give you a lot of food and these types of food in order for you to exercise well. Like it's pretty comparable to like anyone doing any elite sport or elite performing art ever. People know how to treat you. They know how to you have people working for these companies whose sole job it is to make sure that you don't hurt yourself when you're dancing every day, because you are not and it's really annoying for the company if you injure yourself and you can't do any of that. The last thing I tell you is just like, well, maybe you don't get the choice to maybe your social interactions are limited a bit. Maybe you don't get the choice to hang out with bad crowds. I'm a bit unclear why this is a harmonious debate. Secondly, why do we think that you make decisions pretty freely? And they spend a lot of their time telling you why they think it's really bad because you like to be coerced. So I think you should weigh this material very highly. To say that there is a huge social norm in Korea that is that you must go into a professional career, you must study exceptionally hard in school, you must get into a university, and then you must go into a career in that kind of a number of reasons. Firstly, because the South Korean school system is one of the most intense in the world. Secondly, because South Korean suicide rates in high schools are really high because of the amount of pressure that is placed on this. And thirdly, because lots of Korean parents are desperate for their kids to become doctors and to become other really prestigious careers. When they tell you this is likely to be people from low socioeconomic backgrounds because there's a rags to riches firstly, massive assertion. I don't think you can say that just because some celebrities like to market themselves as having a rags to riches norm, you can say that this is qualitatively true for everyone. But also, presumably, if you are in a low socioeconomic family and your family's gee, I really want my kid to make money, surely they would follow the norms of your society and pressure you to be study hard, become a doctor, help get us out of poverty. That is a much more concrete and a much more given their own analysis that a lot of groups don't actually make it. That is clearly the much more logical conclusion that a lot of families would make. What this should tell you is that parents are very, very unlikely to coerce their kids into entering in these contracts. In fact, they're likely to try and coerce them out of it because firstly, it is seen as unprestigious. They would much rather prefer that you follow the norms, engage in that you do really well in high school, that you get into these unis. But secondly, it doesn't make financial sense for them by their own logic. I think parents are smart enough to know that not everyone who becomes a singer will go on to be Taylor Swift level of singing. The second thing is that you make this, so what you should believe then is that you make this decision because you desperately want to, because you have a love for the performing arts. And I think there are a few reasons why this is really important. The fact is just that we should probably care about the ways in which kids want to express themselves, the ways in which people want to express their artistic decision. We tell you, in several instances, of elite sports, of elite performing arts, these are things that we place a lot of value on because they're something that you can only really get good at if you start at a young age. And obviously, especially in a society like South Korea, where perhaps there are these very strong social norms against going into the arts, we ought to value this particularly highly because we should nurture the ways in which people want to express themselves. The last thing is just to say, they give you a few reasons why you can't consent. Firstly, I think these are massively uncomparative to every other industry. If you're studying really hard to become a doctor, presumably you don't know what it's going to look like when you become a doctor. I think, unfortunately, at the age of 13, 14, you just don't know what your future is going to look like. That probably should not tell you that you can't consent to this. Second thing is we're pretty happy to either just say that they can opt out or fear in that they can opt out. The third thing is that they can see that they only win this on principle because they literally tell you, we think this will probably not change either way, but principally it's better if they're not in contract. That's a little bit unclear to me. They also tell you that you think you'll be successful, so it's coercive. Firstly, we've already stepped through why there are norms against this, why you think you are likely to find further success in other fields. Secondly, because by virtue of auditioning to get a contract with a company, it is a massive flag to you that you are competing against tons of other people, that it is a very competitive industry. There are lots of other people that would like to do the same thing that you are doing, maybe. And for that reason, I think it is very clear that perhaps you're not the only person that is vying for any sort of success. Moving on to the second point about why we think this has massive benefits for other people who actually enjoy K-pop. Note that this point is exclusive to when you have the younger idols 16, 17, 18, 19, because these are the types of age demographics that fan bases actually relate to. The first thing is just to say that for Asian diaspora, it is incredibly important to have this kind of representation. There is almost no representation of young Asians in Western media. That is a massive harm because people find it incredibly difficult to feel validated and they find it incredibly difficult to relate to the media in which they see. K-pop is absolutely awesome for that. I think you should weigh that really highly because it is one of the only industries in the world that is filling that gap, and especially filling that gap for young Asian diaspora. The second thing is just to say, students also really enjoy this stuff, and maybe you should rate that really highly because if the school system is as stressful as I've told you, then probably getting some kind of enjoyment out of the fact of seeing that you can take pride in your culture and you can take pride in the art that you consume is really, really important. Thirdly, on the South Korean economy, I guess I don't have time for this. We're very proud to negate.
Look, a lot of the material that he brought up at first are things that can be traded off. So what if we get more representation? So what if individuals can succeed in the K-pop industry? These aren't things that can come at the expense of children's well-being. These aren't things that you can trade off when you coerce children into entering an extremely toxic industry. We thought that was a harm that they had to contend with, and insofar as they don't contend with it at all, we tell you we win this debate on that front. Few things that they bring to us. First, they tell us about why likely the contracts are likely to be good in some form, and they give us three different mechanisms: one about PR, one about fan base, and one about having to do things like just generally good because the terms are good for these individuals and like incentive structures. Note, I think the framing around this necessitates a form of liberal arrogantism into the ways in which we perceive children, which is something that doesn't exist within Korean societies. Note two things about Korean societies that we brought you at first. Attitudes around children are ones that are very toxic, one in which children are perceived to be the tools in which individuals are raised out of the poverty level, which means to say, on a small scale, we see things like sending children off to work at a young age. We see things like children being coerced to do extremely like careers that they don't care about. What all of this tells you is that when you talk about PR, when you talk about things like backlash, this has to be comparative in that we don't think the backlash was something that was very bad. Notably, when individuals believed that the K-pop industry was one that was good, one that individuals could succeed in, that's when this PR didn't exist at all. That's when you don't have individuals defending them. Second, on things like fan base. Notably, sure, this works in the best case where you have a fan base to protect you, but note this debate requires a frame around which we talk about very vulnerable actors that don't have these fan bases. Things like children that entered the industry at the age of 12 that never had anything like media popularity. Notably, when agencies do things like sign trainees, they don't do things like publicize it at a very large basis. They do things like look for talents in terms of singing. They look for things like dancing, for example. And these aren't things that get you like media attention in Korean society. There needs to be an analysis about why this fan base existed within the very first place. The third, I think at the end of all of this, there's just no incentive for contracts to necessarily be good under their side. And in fact, the perspectives that like Korean societies have within the K-pop industry means that they're more likely to be overworked under the side of negative. We thought that was necessarily bad. What do they then go on to tell us? They tell us that sure, these contracts might be good because these companies have an incentive to like keep them safe, like keep them well fed and keep them exercised. Note that this was very engaging with the context around Korean societies that we gave you, in which there's a very, very large amount of individuals that opt into this industry. And it was an industry that was very competitive. It was an industry that relied on very ever-changing and very toxic beauty standards, things that were necessarily harmful within this debate. What does this necessarily mean for the claim that they gave to us? Firstly, when you do things like exercise, you're more likely to be overworked to the point in which you are likely to faint because you needed to get to below a certain amount of weight class. So you could do things like fulfill the very toxic Asian beauty standards that required you to be skinny, to do things like be tall, to do things like be fair. That was very problematic in this debate. When you do things like starve children, when you do things like, for example, overworking them to get them within a certain skill, we thought that was very bad, given that the incentives in status quo were for companies to be able to make a return on their investment. They were likely to do things like overwork the kids. They were likely to do things like harm them in very, very pernicious ways. We don't think this response was sufficient at all. I think the rest of the material they bring to us at first are things that necessarily don't matter when they tell us about how individuals necessarily care about K-pop and they necessarily care about things like representation. No, realize the level of this representation isn't something that individuals necessarily care about. When it comes to representation, you don't just do things like look at a Korean person or look at an Asian person and be like, wow, I feel so necessarily represented, because these aren't the issues that people look to when they want things like representation. They want things like being able to tell their stories. They want to be able to do things like converse about unique Asian struggles that aren't necessarily dealt with within the Korean industry. What this means, even if you do get some form of representation, it wasn't something that Asian diaspora necessarily cared about. And even if you did, just on a principle, note how problematic it was to be able to enter individuals within a bad circumstance so you could feel represented. That was something that we should trade off in this debate. We don't think you should consider this, just drop this from your notes. Let's move on to just why the comparative was necessarily worse. The counterfactual we told you was, even in a worst case scenario where you do want to opt into the Korean industry, it was necessarily going to be in better ways. Why was this the case? You were more likely to be overworked under the side of affirmative. We gave you two mechanisms as to why this was the case. First, note the narrative surrounding idol training contracts frames it such that such as you're able to succeed in the long term if you do things like overwork yourself now. You're able to do things when you have to force yourself to compete against a multitude of individuals out there in order to stand out. What this necessarily meant was not only as a child you are likely to internalize those narratives, you are likely to believe things like, oh, I have to keep working harder, I have to push my limits in order to succeed. We thought this was bad because it meant that children necessarily couldn't enjoy their childhood, which was the harm that we brought to you at first. But secondly, it meant that parents are more likely to do things like justify themselves. They're more likely to do things like rationalize these things when they looked at their children overwork and think, oh, I'm doing this for their good. Oh, I'm doing this for the long term. We thought what this necessarily meant was on the comparative. You have parents being the most important actors within this debate. We told you they were likely to act in more perverse ways. You were likely to give them an incentive to overwork their children. We thought that was necessarily bad. Note that on the side of negative, if children didn't enjoy idle training, they were able to do things like withdraw, to which the response we get from side of negative was, firstly, that we're able to do things like fiat this out. No, this was necessarily not true in a world where we told you that the structures that prevented individuals from exiting weren't necessarily like limited to legal structures. You are likely to do things like rationalize to yourself, oh, I have to stick with it. These were internal narratives that you can't fiat out. We thought they were the most harmful things that existed within this debate. I think secondly, when you reduce this, you remove the narratives that perniciously attack children and perniciously affect the ways in which parents lock their children into within these commercials in the first place. I think secondly, you reduce the amount of sunk cost fallacy that exists in this debate. In that when individuals believe that they've spent like 5 years of their lives within this industry, they were less likely to opt out. Note then, even if they do succeed, why was this necessarily bad? They told us that if you succeed, this was good because you're able to do things like succeed. I think first, on just likelihood, the reason why you can't weight this as highly was because this was something that was very, very unlikely to happen. You are likely to do things like enter within a very competitive society in which many trainees don't succeed. Many trainees don't enter groups. And even if they do enter groups, these are groups that were unlikely to debut for very, very long periods of time. The trade-off here was that you could have done literally anything else that brought you happiness. You're able to do things like explore what you find important. You were able to do things like trade off going to school, for example. These were harms that we brought you. But even if you do succeed, the conditions in which K-pop idols lived were ones that were toxic, ones in which you were likely to be underpaid as feeling obligated back to your company. You're likely to live in squalor. You're likely to live in very, very bad flats that they provided for you because you were likely to be underpaid. At the end of all of this, what's the comparative here? First, know that all the benefits that they told you were things that we couldn't ever trade off for the principal harm of coercing children into like entering this toxic industry in the first place. When you make it so that parents have an incentive to force their child in, when you created an incentive in which children are tricked within entering the industry, that was a principal harm that they had to contend with. But even if we told you that the circumstances surrounding these contracts were ones that were necessarily bad, one in which you are likely to overwork yourself, one in which you are likely exposed to very, very bad harms that will likely affect you the rest of your life. We thought these were the most important harms that you had to consider. Because note that you are likely to retire at a very, very young age, and the harms we presented you are likely to affect you for the rest of your life. Even in that best case, we win this debate.
I thank the second speaker for that speech and welcome the second speaker.
Unfortunately, there are 5 fatal flaws in the affirmative team's case. First flaw is their entire case is contingent on people not being able to opt out of this industry. We tell you quite clearly at Arywn that this is untrue. You can opt out without needing to pay the price of being a trainee if you don't debut. Second problem, they mischaracterize how important of an industry this is to South Korea, importantly to the economy. And they also don't fail to recognize that the large community and the large sense of self and sense of nationalism that is derived from K-pop is incredibly important to South Korea. The third thing they do is they talk about things like body image and like the sunken cost of doing this, but fail to recognize that is entirely symmetric to literally every other field in which you want to achieve success. I.e., if you want to be a doctor, you also are going to feel pressure on you to be a doctor. And that just exists in quite literally every other type of work that you enter into. It is unclear why that is unique to people entering K-pop. But we provide you with 4 different harms that are incredibly unique to South Korea and to the K-pop industry. We tell you that on affirmative, there is literally no representation of young K-pop fans. That is terrible because that is how they derive their image of self and their sense of self in a country that is a post-war state and lacks a sufficient identity. The second thing we tell you is there are massive narratives that exist for Korean students that encourage them into careers in STEM rather than the arts. And K-pop is incredibly important in fostering a love for the arts. The third thing we tell you is that the little cultural narratives that exist in post-war Korea necessarily mean K-pop is an incredibly important avenue for the country to derive a sense of national identity. You ought to care about this debate. But the fourth thing we tell you is that K-pop is imperative to the South Korean economy. And this is true for a couple of reasons, but I'm going to move on to that. In this speech is tell you why our world is far, far better for idols. And there are 6 things. First thing is that beauty standards in South Korea are bad for your self-esteem. But again here, I think that this narrative exists not only in South Korea, but likely every element of the entertainment industry. Beauty standards are terrible and deeply harmful. However, they are neither unique to South Korea nor unique to the K-pop industry. And maybe they do exist to a large extent here, but they are also always going to exist regardless of whether you are a child or an older person entering this industry. Also, there is other avenues that might make you self-conscious over your look. Maybe just watching K-pop as a young person means you are self-conscious about beauty standards. So do we now ban people from watching K-pop in its entirety? That seems quite silly. Second thing they say, massive time commitment. 1, kids willingly enter into this commitment at the point at which they love K-pop and are willing to devote their life to it probably means they care about this and are willing to clock the time that it would take them to work on this hobby. The second thing is, with every profession, there's just a time commitment. Like if your parents tell you to study hard so you can go into STEM, there's the time commitment of studying hard. But the massive harm is, enjoy studying and don't want to go into a career in science. And that's a massive harm to you as an individual because it means that you are likely spending a similar amount of time on both professions, but in our world, you are doing it on something you deeply care about and therefore are more likely to be successful in, as opposed to an affirmative side where you're doing things like studying for a STEM degree you literally could not give less of a shit about, but it's still wasting your time doing this. The next thing they say is that contracts mandate who idols interact with for your reputation. But we tell you that this is actually done in quite a good way because the contracts necessarily care about you as an individual because they want you to succeed. Also, importantly, they mischaracterize the nature of these contracts in training facilities. This to say that like the phrase of those who can't teach is quite true here because these contracts and these companies are necessarily run by people who have been K-pop idols or who are very closely aligned to the K-pop industry. So probably quite aware of the unique harms that happen to K-pop idols and want to make sure that they are immune to those sorts of things and are therefore far more likely to care about them. Also, this is just quite a speculative harm. If you are willing to give the affirmative team the debate based on the fact that like maybe they won't get to hang out with some dodgy like people who take drugs, that's silly. You shouldn't do that panel. Fourth thing they tell you, physical damage of being overworked. This is just really unimportant, unfortunately. You may have physical damage of being overworked, but dear God, if you're an athlete, that is literally every other industry ever. But I actually think this gets far, far worse on their side because what happens is either A, people don't enter into these industries at all, or B, they still enter into it because there is always an inherent desire for them to be a K-pop star, but now they have to do things like train themselves. So it means now they're not at a facility which knows what they should be eating and the types of diets they should be prescribed to, which means they have to do it themselves, and they are far more likely then to do things like not eat enough food, or to give themselves eating disorders, or to have some sort of other physical injury because they overwork themselves, because it is completely unregulated and monitored by themselves. That is far, far more harmful on their side. It also means people are always going to need trainers and like specialists who are going to help them with these sorts of things. Now this industry is almost entirely unregulated. It means kids are literally killing themselves to become K-pop stars. We would far rather this happens in a facility that is monitored by people. Final thing to say here, though, is they tell you that most kids are going to fail. I think this is quite untrue, because I think which you're literally devoting your life to K-pop, you're far more likely to be successful. But also, that's not even a massive harm in this debate, because we tell you that you still go to school, you still get an education, so you quite literally still have the same options you would otherwise have, maybe to a lesser extent. But also, your options are not just like you fail at K-pop, you become a scientist. Maybe you fail at K-pop and then you want to go into the K-pop industry and be like an agent to a K-pop idol. There are obviously adjacent fields you can enter into, but affirmative seems to be one example in the info side that kids at 12 are entering into. All children are 12. They may be 16 and want to be a K-pop star. You can't take all of their harms in our worst case scenario. That is incredibly uncharitable. Korean narratives tell you to go into things like STEM and be successful means that it's incredibly hard for kids to go into these sorts of things. What it does is it legitimizes K-pop as a viable, and that is so helpful to kids who otherwise would be pushed into things and their well-being. We all care about that. But also we tell you to just get far, far better training that doesn't cause any of the unregulated harms you had an affirmative team. That is incredibly important in this debate. Now, why kids aren't coerced? So silly, but I guess I'll keep talking about it. You literally aren't coerced because of the narratives that exist in that area that tell kids to go into STEM or go into art. Obviously, this is just like a formulaic argument that exists in every industry, but to a much lesser extent in South Korea because of the narratives that tell kids that arts are unsuccessful. And that is incredibly important in this debate because it means that kids are far less likely to be coerced. They then tell you that you can't opt out of the K-pop contract, but if you do not debut, you do not have pay back the money that is incredibly important. It means that if at 14 years old you don't want to do it anymore, you have to pay the money you invested because you never debuted as an artist. Say you do debut and then you decide you don't want to do it anymore. That sucks. You've just spent a bit of money going in there. That's really unfortunate, but we are willing to claim that harm because I think it happened in the minority of instances. I think at the point at which you debut and reach the success in the first literally 10 years, probably likely to reap the rewards of this. Important is literally every industry you have a sunk cost of aspirations, right? You're a dancer, you make like point shoes every single week. That's also expensive, but you're always investing in your hobbies. If you want to be an astrophysicist, I don't know, maybe you buy a telescope. Like everything. I think especially literally every other aspect of life, that is silly that they should win the debate on that metric. The final thing they're saying is parents don't view their kids as a man to get out of hobby. One, this narrative is going to be two, this is a massive one that is made with parents and their kids who tell you important places why they're not the best. That is silly. This will obviously not win on that metric. Therefore, proud to negate.
Cool. Thanks.
panel, if you are told every day from the time you are 12 to the time you are 18 that you are not allowed to eat what you want to eat because you have to fit a beauty standard, you have to work 10 hours a day because that's what your contract stipulates you do, we think these are incredibly bad outcomes. What does this mean? It means you're likely to have lasting mental health effects. It means you're probably likely to come out of that with an eating disorder, but you're probably also just likely not to have a childhood. You know, I think the fatal mischaracterization of side negatives is that they think that these contracts allow you to go to school and live a normal life. But no, this is not what this debate is about. These are grueling contracts that stipulate that their children have to work incredibly long hours. Even if they do go to school, it's likely that the entire rest of their day is built around eating the correct things. They're probably not going to have much of a social life. Why is this inherently true in this debate? It's because if you believe their analysis that they can opt out whenever they want, which we'll tell you is not true, but if you believe that's true, it means these people have to put in such incredibly high amounts of work such that they're more likely to succeed in the end. It means they can, like, the reality of this debate is that the work and the grueling efforts that they are putting in is so immeasurably bad for their day-to-day life that it can never be seen as a good thing. The first thing I'm going to do in this speech is I'm going to tell you why these kids can't consent and why their claim that they can opt out whenever they want is just simply not true. Then we're going to talk about what the day-to-day life for these kids actually looks like and why it is so incredibly bad in this debate that they cannot ever win. And then finally, I'll tell you why cultural representation and what actually happens there is not as big of a win con as they try and tell you. The first thing we tell you down the bench is that there is such high levels of coercion that exist that these kids can never truly consent. What do they say? They say that kids opt in because they love it. They know what it's like, and it's the same as any other industry. The first thing that I would say here is that you literally cannot love K-pop when you're working 10 hours a day every single day. No, you might opt in originally because you like the idea of singing and dancing, but it's truly unclear to me why it's likely that you're going to love something when you have to work on it every single day. I don't think it's likely that you are going to love it after that. But the second thing that we tell you, which note this is all just whipping off my first affirmative speech, which is to say that there's such a financial benefit that parents and society co-opt them, and the societal narrative tells them that this is something they ought want to do, means that no 12-year-old, no 13-year-old, no 14-year-old, no 15-year-old is actually going to have an accurate representation of what's happening in this industry. We think in and of itself, the inability to consent to signing these contracts is always going to be a bad thing. So now let's talk about whether or not they can opt out. Because note, they tell you that they have the fiat to just say that these people can opt out. The first thing I would say here is that this is just not reasonable nor charitable in this debate, i.e. they have to defend the idea that contracts exist, which means they are binding. You are not able to opt out whenever you want, because note, if a contract would allow you to opt out, it would mean that we are simply not doing anything. This debate would then be about like, going to choose to go to music lessons. We don't think that this debate is what this is about. Like, and even if this is true, at least in our world, if they are likely to succeed at the end of it, at least the company isn't able to take all their money. So we'll tell you, even if that is the correct characterization that they can always opt out, we still win because we don't want a world where the label is taking all their money because they signed a contract when they were 12. But the second thing I'll go through is all the reasons why it's incredibly unlikely that you'll be able to opt out of these contracts. The first thing here to say is that the amount of resources and like equipment and lifestyle and training that you're getting is very, very, very expensive. This is to say that the company is spending a lot of money making sure that you end up becoming good at your job, and they're investing a lot of assets and resources into you. This means at the end of it, they are not likely to give contracts to people when you can opt out, because if you believe their analysis that they can leave whenever they want, what K-pop firm is ever going to give these contracts? Because note, then literally the vast majority of these people can just always leave. They can opt out whenever they want, which means there's no financial benefit to ever signing these 12-year-olds. It means maybe you'll only sign, like, trainee contracts will simply no longer exist because that is something that you would never consider. You'd only ever sign them at the point where they are good at their job, which is to say no longer a trainee. But it's also just like, there's like no benefit to the entire case if you believe that they can opt out as they say that they could. But the final thing I'll say here is that parents are likely sold a narrative to sign longer contracts that lock them in. This is to say you are told that if you sign a 5-year contract, the company will be more favorable to your kid. They're not going to drop you whenever. That it means that you'll have better outcomes, you'll have better resources. This is to say that there's an incentive for these firms to tell the parent that if you sign longer term contracts, you'll actually be better off in the end because your kid will be more favorable in the system and will get better circumstances. This is to say that maybe if contracts can be opted opted out in some worlds, we think because of the societal narratives that these parents are told, it's likely that they will specifically opt their children into contracts which are longer term. This is to say that I'm pretty confident in this debate. It is a charitable characterization to say it's unlikely that they can opt out whenever they want. Now we're going to talk about their assessment that they say that no kid is opting in because K-pop is not very popular and it's like not very prestigious and it's not very, like STEM is more important is their analysis that they give, right? Then that's what culture says in Korea. The first thing that I would say here is that this is just empirically untrue, right? It is very popular, it is very prestigious, and a lot of people know that you can make a lot of money, and parents are likely to do this when they're sending their kid. But the second thing I would say here is that the cultural narrative that exists in Korea is far more likely to be favorable to people that work hard as opposed to working hard specifically in STEM. I.e., someone like Sun Heung-min, a football star, is very popular because he like works very hard at football. This is to say that sports stars and K-pop stars are very prestigious and looked after well. I.e., they're not saying in Korea you have to work hard in STEM. They're saying you have to work hard in what it is you choose to do and how you want to derive your money. This is to say that the cultural narrative will exist for K-pop if you are very good and you work very hard. You will always like the cultural narrative is what it is. They say that they say that you can't know what it'll be like in any other thing. We tell you, note here, trading off school is always something that is bad. Right? Trading off like the time commitments of having a social life and developing yourself as a human being is always bad. No, you don't know what you want at 12. You can't know and you cannot consent. We think we have won this debate on the simple premise that we prefer kids having more things. Now let's talk about the day-to-day lives. They say that companies treat you well for PR reasons. I think one, it's very easy to bad actions, i.e., like threatening to drop you from your contract if you tell people that they're doing bad shit. The second thing is it's pretty easy to put on a facade when you go to the media and put on a smile. Three, we think it's like kids working hard and forcing them to work hard does not have the same cultural effect in Korea as it does in the West. I.e., their analysis of also about schoolwork is true in this sense. I.e., it's not going to be the backward. They say companies give them the best food and the training to be healthy. We say that the incentive is not like sport, it's to make them skinny, and it's bad, right? Because you have to fit a beauty narrative. It's not the same incentive. Also, the health trade-offs of stress. Now, so at the end of this, I think it's pretty clear. You're working 10 hours. You're like eating bad. You're eating not much food to hit it. If you choose not to do this, you'll be dropped from your contract. That's something you ought not want to do. That the day-to-day life is very terrible. Now let's talk about cultural. They say you get more representation. I say it's unclear why you represent this. Still get the same amount of famous people coming into the table. The second thing here is that you can become idols without being trainees. Maybe trainee. That's something that's that's less trained idols. Maybe they're not as we tell you that's so much better than having the representation is probably just also better because maybe you have some plus-size K-pop. Maybe you have some people that are more directly representative of the wider Korean culture, not just the city. I think it's pretty clear in this debate that the life you're living as a trainee is not what you want to consider good. Years ago. Vaccines own characterization is definitely important. They explain that children are perceived as tools by their parents. That means that people opting out, ones with control over that, not the kids themselves. Parents parents that over control. And those are people, as they explain,
see this to their kids as a profit, most likely to not be able to conceptualize the harms of not getting enough food, because they see their kid getting more beautiful and those reasons. A lot of their harms opting out cannot occur in space for that specific reason. First question I'm going to ask is whether or not you can opt out. I'm going to give very quick, like debatory topic thing, which is that the topic says you can sign contracts, not that you can't drop out of them. I think it's very fair to say that we have the fiat to do stuff like, 3-year contract where you have renewal clauses. But I'm also going to give some structural reasons as to why, one, the Korean government is likely to want this, and two, why companies are likely to want to do it. Firstly, why the Korean government is likely wants people to be able to opt out. Firstly, the government cares very deeply about how the industry is perceived, because the K-pop industry is an optics one. The vast majority of revenue that the Korean government makes through the K-pop industry is through the liaising with big brands, which is why optics and perception is incredibly important. They say that Koreans don't care. Yes, but other states do. Companies that work with them care exceptionally deeply about the practices in the industry, which means they are likely to want people to be able to opt out if conditions are terrible. Thirdly, companies are likely to take people who are older because it is a better investment because things are more certain. I.e., if you are able to construct opt-out clauses and then take people at the very end of your their teen years, means that is a better investment for you as a company because it is much more certain your guarantee of return on investment. Fourthly, as a company, you can drop trainees who are the bad ones, right? You don't have to continue hiring someone who's actively is not going to make it in the industry, which means it makes so much sense for companies to do this. And they say that companies think it's not profitable if they can. Companies think it's not profitable if they can opt out, so they don't hire people. This happens on their side, right? For older people now, as I think the third affirmative says, now older people are just hired instead. I would say that it's actively very, very terrible harm because the opportunity cost of an older person engaging in the K-pop industry is having a job, right? And that is far more terrible for the reason that when you're a kid engaging in the K-pop industry, you have the security network of your parents cooking dinner for you. And when you opt out, you have those things to back you up. You can go into school. If you're an adult, you're actively taking away from your experience and getting a job and actively not building up savings in the first place, which is why it's incredibly damaging. The importance of this material is twofold. One, a lot of their harms in this debate go away. The material about consent goes away. The material about whether or not these things are actively exceptionally damaging goes away in this debate. And our harms are the ones that are plausibly likely to exist. Our benefits are the ones that are likely to exist. What are they and why are they so? First one is that we explain that having companies that are in the K-pop industry being better at producing K-pop is likely to be something that is exceptionally good. We give two reasons for this. First is that when people are trained better, it means they're actually better at producing songs. When you have dancers that are better at dancing, right, it means your videos get more views on YouTube. It's probably more plausible. But secondly, we explain at the start of Aryn's speech why the demographics of K-pop is exceptionally important. Why it is likely that you care about skewing your audience young, because the K-pop industry does skew exceptionally young. Why it is very important that you are able to get buy-ins these people. You're able to get 18-year-olds. And no, we explain why on our side you're able to get 18-year-olds who have set brand recognition. Because if you have a lock-in contract and the company can create a cult of personality around you, when you debut, you already have that fan base at 18 or 19, which means it's far, far better. The reason that is important is that one, you get representation in the arts. And secondly, you grow South Korea's economy. And they never respond to this at all. I want to impact this in two ways. One, the very concrete impact that BTS comprise 1% of South Korea's entire GDP, but also that K-pop industries aren't just the idols. It is the people working in those companies, people in the offices who do the PR and maintenance. You have to hire so many people to liaise with venues to make sure that merchandise goes well. Jobs for tourists who go to see these facilities. The reason that wins us the debate is because we explain that their harms go away and ours are probably likely to occur and probably likely to be somewhat. So next, let's talk about children's well-being. No, we deal with this in the first issue, but I want to completely take down all of them. First is, they say that children are perceived to be tools of profit. We explain that one, this is likely to be exceptionally damaging to their side. It means parents and the people, like the adults, see children to be profit. So likely to ignore all of their concerns. And I just do not believe that the kids are the ones who have the ability to opt out. Guess what? Who's the one in control control of a 15-year-old and their decision. Probably much more likely to be a parent who is the one that also has to double sign. They say probably likely to be a parent. But secondly, kids consult their parents if they're going to drop out, and you face a lot of external pressure if you have to go to your parent who worked so hard to get into that industry and say, "I'm going to drop out." They're likely to get super different out of you, right? It means on their side, people are not able to opt out. They're not able to opt out well. Secondly, I think it also explains why if parents are likely, so parents are likely to have a sunk cost analysis. So you invest a ton of time in means it hurts you very, very deeply when it's likely to counsel them against it. You're likely to put an enormous amount of pressure. Noting that in South Korean culture, parents have a huge amount of control over their kids. Kids are very likely just going to use their parents. Secondly, their analysis, I will stick with it, means that a lot of kids cop the harm because they internalize it. They say, "I am not good enough at this," and they put it on themselves rather than upon the industry. Because the industry has a ton of propaganda as to the way in which the kids that are likely to go into this expect themselves to do really well, which means if they are bullies, they are likely to internalize that in a really, really bad way. I think that's much more plausible for a person who expects so much of them, who envisions themselves as the next idol to do that rather than like service. So that actually is why children's well-being doesn't go. The next thing is that on their side of contracts, companies can also cut you in really bad ways. That is likely to be pretty cool. They say that companies invest in you and they want a return on investment. Yes, this is the exact reason why they're likely to carry through their investment. And not only do companies have policies, they've also economically invested a ton. It doesn't make economic sense to drop you. This is why companies are vastly with their claims. The first claim, parents have financial incentives. I think this is precisely the opposite. This makes very little financial sense unless you know your kid is going to do well, unless you put a ton of money effort into getting your kid to succeed. They say that you are low SES. I think it's the opposite. Because of how competitive it is, like that you've already got training before. Your parents have put you through so many classes in order to get you but also there are so many anything else. Unlike the media and pop culture, I would say that other K-pop industries have incentive to weaponize their idols all out bad practices. The reason that you are competing for content. So you want to sign with that people. So if another company does something terrible, you have the incentive to get more idols. At the end of this, one, if you doubt, kills all of our get to trade all of our benefits for nothing. Take them on that. Prove by people, prove by well-being, artists better. Those are things.
Thank you, Ron. Please. Damon?
Good job. I